Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, the truth behind their love. In the quiet moments before dawn settled over Los Angeles, Keanu Reeves found himself standing alone on the balcony of his home, staring into the soft gold light creeping over the horizon, as if the sky was whispering a memory he could no longer escape. Hollywood had always been loud, bright, and unforgiving, yet this morning carried a gentle silence, a silence that reminded him of only one person, someone whose presence had shaped more of his life than he had ever dared to admit: Sandra Bullock. It had been years since they first met on the set of Speed, but the memories of those days never aged. They stayed suspended in time, vivid like freshly carved scenes, filled with laughter that came from somewhere deep and sincere. Keanu remembered the way Sandra's energy filled every room, how she combined humor with intelligence, warmth with brilliance, vulnerability with a rare emotional honesty that made everyone around her feel lighter, including him. Even back then, long before the world speculated, long before fans whispered their theories, and long before magazines tried to turn their connection into a spectacle, Keanu knew there was something about her that went beyond chemistry, beyond co-star camaraderie, beyond the temporary closeness actors share during filming. There was something real, something grounding, something human. And in an industry where so much was fabricated, that kind of authenticity was a lifeline. Sandra, on the other hand, had always felt that Keanu was unlike anyone she had ever worked with. She remembered how he listened, not the polite nod and smile kind of listening, but the kind of listening that made her feel her words mattered. She remembered the unusual calmness in his eyes, the subtle kindness in the way he moved, and the gentle patience in the way he treated every person on set with equal respect, from the lead actors to the newest production assistants. Even then, she sensed that behind his quiet demeanor was a heart carrying stories of resilience, loss, loyalty, and empathy. And it was that depth, unspoken yet unmistakable, that made Sandra feel a connection that defied the timeline of their acquaintance. She often told her friends that Keanu wasn't simply a good man. He was the kind of man who reminded you what goodness actually meant. But as their friendship deepened, Sandra began to realize that some connections are too delicate to label, too meaningful to rush, and too rare to gamble with. She valued him, she admired him, and a part of her feared that understanding the truth of her feelings might complicate the purity of what they already shared. So she tucked those emotions quietly into the corners of her heart, convincing herself that timing was a delicate dance life would someday choreograph if it was meant to be. Yet life has a way of testing connections that are destined to matter. And as the years passed, both Keanu and Sandra continued to cross paths, not just in events and interviews, but in moments of unexpected vulnerability. There were days when the world weighed heavily on Keanu's shoulders, and Sandra would call out of nowhere, sensing the storm without needing proof. There were nights when Sandra questioned her purpose or felt overwhelmed by the pressures of fame, and Keanu would send a message so thoughtful, so quietly supportive, that it felt like a hand reaching through the noise to steady her. Their bond was not built on grand gestures, but on small, sincere acts that accumulated into something meaningful. Their conversations were not filled with melodrama, but with honesty and mutual respect. They never confessed anything, yet they never needed to. Something lived between them, something unspoken but undeniable. On one of those quiet evenings when the world seemed too loud, Sandra found herself alone in her kitchen, staring at a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink. She was tired, the kind of tired that didn't come from work but from life itself. Her career was flourishing, but her heart felt strangely hollow. She had experienced loss, heartbreak, and the weight of expectations from millions of eyes watching her every move. She didn't reach out to many people during such moments, but her instinct guided her toward a familiar name in her contacts. When she heard Keanu's voice on the other side of the line, steady and warm, the tension inside her began to dissolve. They talked for almost 2 hours about nothing and everything: life, purpose, the unpredictability of time. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Keanu said something she would never forget. "The world will always try to rush you, Sandy. But your soul will never follow the clocks people set for you." That night, Sandra realized how deeply he understood her, perhaps more than anyone ever had. Years later, when their fans still whispered about their connection, when interviewers teased them about what could have been, and when Hollywood kept bringing their names together in headlines filled with speculation, Keanu and Sandra quietly continued being constants in each other's lives. They celebrated each other's successes, supported each other through silent struggles, and protected each other's privacy in a world that demanded exposure. But the truth, the real truth behind their love was something only they carried. It wasn't a romance designed to satisfy public fantasy. It wasn't a fairy tale borrowed from a movie plot, and it wasn't a dramatic confession waiting to unfold on a red carpet. It was something far more profound, a rare soul connection built on empathy, understanding, timing, and mutual respect. A connection that shaped who they were as individuals, even if its full expression remained unspoken. And yet, as Keanu stood on his balcony that morning, the sun rising slowly behind him, he wondered whether silence had protected them or prevented something beautiful from ever becoming real. He wondered whether holding back had been wise or a mistake he would carry forever. He wondered whether Sandra knew just how deeply he admired her, not as a co-star, not as a friend, but as a human being whose presence had illuminated some of his darkest nights. And somewhere across the city, as Sandra sat with her journal open on her lap, she wondered the same thing. She wondered whether some truths were never meant to stay buried, whether timing was no longer the barrier it once was, and whether it was time, finally, to let the world and each other discover the truth behind their love. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, the truth behind their love. As the days stretched on after that quiet morning of reflection, Keanu Reeves found himself surrounded by the usual noise of Hollywood life, yet feeling more disconnected from it than ever. Every meeting, every script discussion, every red carpet invitation began to feel like a blur, as though his mind was elsewhere, because in truth it was. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in his life, like a gentle turning of the earth beneath his feet, directing him toward a truth he had avoided for decades. His connection with Sandra had always existed in a sacred corner of his heart, protected, never exploited, never pushed beyond its natural pace. But now, the thoughts he once tucked away were stirring, rising to the surface with an intensity he could no longer ignore. He found himself revisiting memories he had kept locked away, the way her laughter carried warmth even in the coldest rooms, the way her eyes softened when she talked about the people she loved, and the way she always noticed when he was hurting even when he said nothing. It wasn't longing rooted in romance alone. It was a longing to finally honor the truth of what she meant to him, a truth too powerful to stay hidden forever. Sandra, meanwhile, was experiencing her own emotional awakening. Sitting in the garden behind her home one evening, watching the last threads of sunlight slip through the trees, she felt an unexplainable heaviness, the weight of something unfinished, something unsaid, something she had held in her heart for far too long. She had always been good at hiding her feelings behind humor, good at distracting the world with her charm, but when it came to Keanu, she could never fully mask the truth. She didn't know when it started, perhaps during the long days filming Speed, or during their second movie together, or in the quiet years between projects when their friendship quietly strengthened. But somewhere along the way, he had become a constant in her emotional universe. He was the one she trusted without hesitation, the one she admired without condition, and the one whose presence made her feel safe in an industry where sincerity was rare and often exploited. Yet she had never dared to unravel the deeper truth that her heart whispered during her loneliest nights, that Keanu was not just someone she cared about, but someone she could have loved in a way that transcended scripts, roles, or expectations. Life had never allowed them an easy path. Timing had always stood between them, sometimes cruelly, sometimes gently, but always firmly enough to keep them from fully acknowledging the depth of their bond. Sandra had been in relationships when Keanu was not. Keanu had been navigating grief and personal loss during times when Sandra needed lightness and clarity. And though their paths crossed repeatedly, the universe seemed to hold them in a delicate state of almost love, almost confession, almost soulmates. Yet even despite the unspoken boundaries, they cherished their connection more fiercely than many couples ever cherished open love. They protected one another from the harshness of the industry, from the distortions of tabloids, from the invasiveness of curious fans. They became each other's safe place, even if they never admitted it out loud. One evening after a long day on set, Sandra received a message from Keanu that surprised her, not because it was from him but because of its unexpected tenderness. It read simply, "Do you ever wonder what life would have looked like if we hadn't been scared?" She stared at the message for several minutes, her heart racing with emotions she had pushed down for years. Keanu had never used such direct words before, never questioned the invisible line they had both agreed, silently, to respect. But something in his text felt like a question from the deepest part of him, a moment where his vulnerability peeked through the guarded layers he usually carried so carefully. Sandra typed several responses, deleting each one as quickly as she wrote it, because nothing felt adequate, nothing felt safe enough to match the weight of his honesty. She finally wrote the truth she had avoided. "Sometimes I think about it more than I should." Once she hit send, her hands trembled, not out of fear but out of long-suppressed truth breaking free. Keanu read her message again and again, his breath growing heavier each time. Her words carried a sincerity he had sensed but never dared to believe. For the first time in decades, he felt the invisible wall between them shift, as though their carefully maintained boundaries were beginning to melt. He typed back slowly, each word carrying more weight than he intended to reveal. Maybe it's not too late to find out. That single line felt like opening a locked door he had stood before for years, wondering what was on the other side but never allowing himself to step through. And for Sandra, reading that message felt like the universe had finally exhaled after holding its breath too long. The days that followed were filled with a tension neither of them could ignore. They didn't speak immediately after that exchange, not because they were avoiding each other, but because they both needed time to truly absorb the meaning behind their words. Their connection had always been powerful, but now it held the weight of possibility, something beautiful, something transformative, something that could either become the greatest gift of their lives or the most painful truth they would ever confront. Sandra found herself replaying their memories, tiny moments she had once dismissed, but now understood differently. How he always waited for her to finish speaking, giving her undivided attention in a room full of distractions. How he never objectified her or treated her like an accessory in a male-dominated industry. How he offered kindness without expectation, empathy without calculation, and support without needing credit. She realized these weren't traits she admired casually. These were qualities she cherished deeply, qualities that made her heart feel understood and valued. Keanu, on the other hand, spent his nights in contemplation, remembering every moment when Sandra's presence had brought warmth into his darkest struggles. He remembered how she checked on him after the loss of his loved ones, not through public gestures but through quiet, consistent care. She never intruded, never demanded emotional explanations, never pressured him to heal faster. She simply existed in the background of his grief, offering the kind of support that expected nothing in return. He had always believed that love was not defined by romance alone, but by loyalty, kindness, and the ability to feel seen without needing to speak. And Sandra had given him that kind of connection effortlessly. Their bond was unspoken love, but it was love nonetheless. Not the dramatic Hollywood kind plastered on magazines, but the kind that grew in the spaces between silence, the kind that survived years of distance and life changes, the kind that lingered in shared glances and half-smiles long after the world stopped watching. And now, for the first time, they were both acknowledging the truth they had danced around for half their lives. When they finally met for dinner after weeks of emotional tension, the air between them carried a charge neither could ignore. They greeted each other gently, no dramatic embrace, no exaggerated gestures, just the familiar comfort of being in each other's presence. Yet something was undeniably different. Their eyes held a deeper understanding, a mutual acknowledgement that the words they had exchanged were not passing curiosity but deeply rooted truth. Sandra sat across from him, her smile soft but uncertain, while Keanu watched her with the quiet intensity he had always possessed. Their conversation began as it often did, with laughter, shared jokes, and anecdotes. But beneath the surface, their hearts beat with the same unspoken realization, that the truth behind their love had finally begun to surface, and neither of them could return to their old silence. This dinner, this moment, this shift, it wasn't the climax of their story. It was the beginning of the chapter they had both waited years to write. The night of their long-awaited dinner unfolded with a gentle elegance neither of them expected, as if time itself slowed down to honor the moment that had been silently approaching for decades. The restaurant was quiet, softly lit with warm amber tones that wrapped around them like a comforting embrace, giving the illusion that they had stepped into a world where their connection could finally exist without barriers. But even as the candles flickered and the distant hum of soft jazz floated through the air, the weight of their unspoken truth lingered between them, a fragile thing that had waited years for acknowledgement. Keanu felt it first, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the quiet emotional gravity that tugged at him whenever he looked at Sandra. She seemed different tonight, not in appearance but in presence, as though something inside her had finally aligned with something inside him. Her eyes carried more depth, her smile held more vulnerability, and her silence spoke in ways words never could. He had known her for so long, yet tonight he felt as though he was meeting a part of her that had been waiting behind the curtains of time. Sandra felt the same shift, an unfamiliar stirring inside her chest, a tension that tasted like hope mixed with fear. All these years, she had convinced herself that whatever existed between her and Keanu was meant to stay untouched, preserved like a rare painting behind glass. But now, staring at him across the table, feeling the sincerity of his gaze lingering on her every word, she realized that her heart had grown tired of silence. It wasn't that she wanted dramatic declarations or romantic confessions. It was that she wanted to stop pretending that her emotions didn't exist. She wanted to stop telling herself that what they shared was simply friendship when every part of her knew it was more. And as he spoke, slowly, thoughtfully, with that familiar gentleness that always felt like safety, Sandra felt years of buried feelings rising to the surface like a tide that could no longer be held back. She didn't interrupt him, didn't try to lighten the mood with humor like she usually did. Instead, she listened with an openness she had never allowed before, because she sensed that this moment mattered more than either of them understood. Keanu spoke about life, about change, about the way time had reshaped his understanding of what truly mattered. He talked about the fleeting nature of fame, the fragility of happiness, and the quiet importance of surrounding oneself with people who brought real meaning into one's life. He didn't mention her directly, but he didn't have to. Sandra heard herself in every word, felt her presence woven between every line he spoke. She felt a warmth in her chest, not the fleeting kind that came from temporary affection, but the profound warmth of being valued by someone whose soul she respected deeply. When he paused, taking a small sip of his drink, Sandra took a slow breath, trying to steady the emotions gathering inside her. She wanted to speak too, but she also wanted to choose her words carefully because this was a moment that could not be undone or taken lightly. When she finally responded, her voice was soft, almost trembling but steady with truth. She spoke about how hard it had been to live under the spotlight, how difficult it was to trust people whose intentions shifted with the winds of opportunity, and how rare it was to find someone who saw her for who she truly was. She admitted that throughout her life, she had always carried a quiet sense of loneliness, even at the peak of her fame, because genuine connection was something she rarely found. But then she looked at him, her gaze lingering with a tenderness he couldn't ignore, and she said something that made his breath catch in his chest. "You've always been my calm in the chaos." Keanu's eyes softened, no, they deepened, as though her words touched a part of him he thought no one could reach. He didn't speak, he simply listened, absorbing her vulnerability with a reverence that made Sandra's heart ache. The conversation slowly drifted into the kind of emotional honesty they had never dared to enter before, both of them shedding years of guardedness in the safety of each other's presence. For the first time, Sandra allowed herself to express how deeply she admired his resilience, his humility, and the quiet strength he carried even through unimaginable personal loss. She confessed how often she had wished she could ease his pain, even when he refused to burden others with it. She admitted how she always felt protective of him, not out of pity, but out of a genuine desire to safeguard a soul she believed the world didn't fully appreciate. Keanu, moved beyond anything he expected, responded with his own truths, how she had been a constant light through some of his darkest years, how her laughter had given him strength when grief had hollowed him out, how her kindness had reminded him that hope still existed. He told her she was one of the few people who made him feel understood without explanation, and that this kind of connection didn't come twice in a lifetime. As their words poured out, the space between them began to change, not with romance but with raw truth. It was the kind of truth that revealed itself only after years of quiet loyalty, after years of love disguised as friendship, after years of pretending they were unaffected by each other. They weren't making promises, they weren't confessing love, they weren't stepping into a relationship. They were simply acknowledging the truth behind their bond, a truth that had always existed but had never been named. And that acknowledgement alone felt like a doorway opening inside both of them. The dinner ended not with clarity but with possibility. When Keanu walked Sandra to her car, he didn't hug her immediately. They stood for a moment, just looking at each other in the dim glow of the streetlight, both sensing that tonight had changed everything. And then slowly, gently, he reached for her hand, not in a romantic gesture, not in a grand declaration, but in a quiet, grounding way that said, "We're not hiding anymore." Sandra didn't pull away. Her fingers curled into his with an ease that felt like something her heart had known long before her mind ever admitted it. As she drove home, her heart beating in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, she whispered to herself the truth she had long denied. She had never stopped wondering what their life could have been. And now, for the first time, she sensed that the universe might finally be aligning the chapter they were always meant to face together. Keanu, driving home in the quiet night, felt the same awakening. Their love, unspoken for years, had finally begun to breathe. The night of their long-awaited dinner unfolded with a gentle elegance neither of them expected, as if time itself slowed down to honor the moment that had been silently approaching for decades. The restaurant was quiet, softly lit with warm amber tones that wrapped around them like a comforting embrace, giving the illusion that they had stepped into a world where their connection could finally exist without barriers. But even as the candles flickered and the distant hum of soft jazz floated through the air, the weight of their unspoken truth lingered between them, a fragile thing that had waited years for acknowledgement. Keanu felt it first, the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the quiet emotional gravity that tugged at him whenever he looked at Sandra. She seemed different tonight, not in appearance but in presence, as though something inside her had finally aligned with something inside him. Her eyes carried more depth, her smile held more vulnerability, and her silence spoke in ways words never could. He had known her for so long, yet tonight he felt as though he was meeting a part of her that had been waiting behind the curtains of time. Sandra felt the same shift, an unfamiliar stirring inside her chest, a tension that tasted like hope mixed with fear. All these years, she had convinced herself that whatever existed between her and Keanu was meant to stay untouched, preserved like a rare painting behind glass. But now, staring at him across the table, feeling the sincerity of his gaze lingering on her every word, she realized that her heart had grown tired of silence. It wasn't that she wanted dramatic declarations or romantic confessions. It was that she wanted to stop pretending that her emotions didn't exist. She wanted to stop telling herself that what they shared was simply friendship when every part of her knew it was more. And as he spoke, slowly, thoughtfully, with that familiar gentleness that always felt like safety, Sandra felt years of buried feelings rising to the surface like a tide that could no longer be held back. She didn't interrupt him, didn't try to lighten the mood with humor like she usually did. Instead, she listened with an openness she had never allowed before, because she sensed that this moment mattered more than either of them understood. Keanu spoke about life, about change, about the way time had reshaped his understanding of what truly mattered. He talked about the fleeting nature of fame, the fragility of happiness, and the quiet importance of surrounding oneself with people who brought real meaning into one's life. He didn't mention her directly, but he didn't have to. Sandra heard herself in every word, felt her presence woven between every line he spoke. She felt a warmth in her chest, not the fleeting kind that came from temporary affection, but the profound warmth of being valued by someone whose soul she respected deeply. When he paused, taking a small sip of his drink, Sandra took a slow breath, trying to steady the emotions gathering inside her. She wanted to speak too, but she also wanted to choose her words carefully because this was a moment that could not be undone or taken lightly. When she finally responded, her voice was soft, almost trembling but steady with truth. She spoke about how hard it had been to live under the spotlight, how difficult it was to trust people whose intentions shifted with the winds of opportunity, and how rare it was to find someone who saw her for who she truly was. She admitted that throughout her life, she had always carried a quiet sense of loneliness, even at the peak of her fame, because genuine connection was something she rarely found. But then she looked at him, her gaze lingering with a tenderness he couldn't ignore, and she said something that made his breath catch in his chest. "You've always been my calm in the chaos." Keanu's eyes softened, no, they deepened, as though her words touched a part of him he thought no one could reach. He didn't speak, he simply listened, absorbing her vulnerability with a reverence that made Sandra's heart ache. The conversation slowly drifted into the kind of emotional honesty they had never dared to enter before, both of them shedding years of guardedness in the safety of each other's presence. For the first time, Sandra allowed herself to express how deeply she admired his resilience, his humility, and the quiet strength he carried even through unimaginable personal loss. She confessed how often she had wished she could ease his pain, even when he refused to burden others with it. She admitted how she always felt protective of him, not out of pity, but out of a genuine desire to safeguard a soul she believed the world didn't fully appreciate. Keanu, moved beyond anything he expected, responded with his own truths, how she had been a constant light through some of his darkest years, how her laughter had given him strength when grief had hollowed him out, how her kindness had reminded him that hope still existed. He told her she was one of the few people who made him feel understood without explanation, and that this kind of connection didn't come twice in a lifetime. As their words poured out, the space between them began to change, not with romance but with raw truth. It was the kind of truth that revealed itself only after years of quiet loyalty, after years of love disguised as friendship, after years of pretending they were unaffected by each other. They weren't making promises, they weren't confessing love, They weren't stepping into a relationship. They were simply acknowledging the truth behind their bond, a truth that had always existed but had never been named. And that acknowledgement alone felt like a doorway opening inside both of them. The dinner ended not with clarity but with possibility. When Keanu walked Sandra to her car, he didn't hug her immediately. They stood for a moment, just looking at each other in the dim glow of the streetlight, both sensing that tonight had changed everything. And then slowly, gently, he reached for her hand, not in a romantic gesture, not in a grand declaration, but in a quiet, grounding way that said, "We're not hiding anymore." Sandra didn't pull away. Her fingers curled into his with an ease that felt like something her heart had known long before her mind ever admitted it. As she drove home, her heart beating in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, she whispered to herself the truth she had long denied. She had never stopped wondering what their life could have been. And now, for the first time, she sensed that the universe might finally be aligning the chapter they were always meant to face together. Keanu, driving home in the quiet night, felt the same awakening. Their love, unspoken for years, had finally begun to breathe. In the days following their unforgettable dinner, Keanu and Sandra found themselves moving through their lives with an awareness that felt almost otherworldly, as if the entire universe had shifted its axis to create space for something long overdue. Both of them carried the memory of that evening like a quiet flame that refused to dim, glowing steadily within them no matter how much the world demanded their attention. Keanu felt it in the quiet moments between filming scenes, in the stillness of early mornings when he walked through his home with a cup of tea in his hand, and especially in the way his chest tightened whenever his mind drifted to Sandra's smile. It wasn't a new emotion. It was simply an old one waking up, stretching, and finally acknowledging its own existence. He found himself reminiscing over years of conversations, red carpet appearances where he stood beside her with a natural ease that never existed with anyone else, and interviews where their chemistry crackled so visibly that even the hosts couldn't help commenting on it. Looking back, he realized that the truth had always been hiding in plain sight. They were two souls orbiting the same emotional gravity, even when they promised themselves they would stay just friends. Sandra, too, felt a shift that she couldn't ignore. As she navigated her usual routine, script readings, meetings, charity commitments, and household responsibilities, she noticed that her heart felt lighter, as if a weight she didn't know she was carrying had finally released its hold. She caught herself smiling unexpectedly, remembering the softness in Keanu's eyes when he held her hand that night, the sincerity in his voice when he spoke about priorities, and the vulnerability he allowed her to witness. She had always admired his humility, his gentle spirit, his quiet strength, but now she felt those qualities in ways that stirred something deeper inside her. She began to wonder how much of her life had been shaped by the subtle presence he had always offered, how many decisions she had made with the subconscious knowledge that somewhere in the world, there was a man who genuinely cared for her without asking for anything in return. It became clear to her that the connection she shared with Keanu was not one of fleeting emotion, but one built on years of unspoken loyalty. Yet even with their hearts opening in new ways, both Keanu and Sandra felt a delicate hesitation, a fear of stepping too quickly into something that demanded patience and respect. They had spent decades protecting their connection from the turmoil of the industry, shielding it even from themselves, and now that the doors were finally beginning to open, they wanted to be careful, intentional, and deeply present. This wasn't the kind of relationship that thrived on impulsive decisions or dramatic declarations. It was a bond that deserved to unfold with the same grace it had shown them throughout the years. And so, instead of rushing into romantic confessions, they chose a quiet, gentle approach. They spent more time together. Their renewed closeness began with simple moments, afternoon coffees, long walks through quiet neighborhoods where no paparazzi lingered, and late-night phone calls that spilled into hours without either of them noticing how much time had passed. During one of those walks, Sandra noticed a shift in Keanu's energy. He was unusually contemplative, his gaze distant yet soft, as though he was carrying a question he hadn't yet found the courage to ask. She slowed her pace, gently nudging him with her elbow, silently inviting him to speak. Keanu took a breath, his voice warm but uncertain, and said that he had been thinking a lot about life. Not the glamorous parts, not the achievements, but the quiet moments that defined a person's purpose. He admitted to her that the older he got, the more he realized that the greatest measure of a life well lived wasn't awards or fame, but the people who made your soul feel at home. As he spoke, Sandra felt her eyes grow warm with emotion, because she understood exactly what he was trying to say without him saying the words directly. Keanu paused, gathering the courage that had taken him years to build, and then added softly, "You've always been that person for me, Sandy?" Sandra froze, not out of shock, but out of profound recognition. Her heart swelled with feelings she had buried for decades, feelings she never believed she would hear reflected back to her in such an honest, tender way. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tightened her scarf around her neck, trying to steady the emotions rising inside her. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with sincerity as she confessed that he had been the one person whose presence felt like home, even when she didn't know what home meant anymore. She admitted she had carried this truth in silence, because she feared damaging the bond that sustained her through so many turbulent years. In that moment, their connection deepened in ways neither expected. They weren't confessing love in the dramatic sense. They were confessing understanding, alignment, and truth. It wasn't romance driven by impulse, but intimacy built on decades of emotional compatibility. Something inside both of them softened. Something inside both of them broke open. And something inside both of them finally healed. After that conversation, Sandra invited Keanu to her home for dinner, wanting to create a space where they could continue talking without the interruptions of the outside world. She spent hours preparing a meal, not because she wanted to impress him, but because she wanted to offer a piece of herself, something genuine and unfiltered. When Keanu arrived, he brought flowers, not elegant roses or extravagant bouquets, but simple wildflowers he picked intentionally because he remembered a conversation years ago when Sandra said they reminded her of childhood. Her heart melted. It was such a Keanu thing to do, thoughtful, nostalgic, and deeply symbolic in ways no one else would ever consider. Their evening unfolded with a natural ease, filled with laughter, deep conversations, shared memories, and moments of silence that felt more intimate than words. At one point, Sandra asked Keanu whether he ever regretted not exploring what existed between them earlier in their lives. He took a long pause before answering, not out of uncertainty, but out of a desire to speak the truth with care. He told her that he didn't believe in regret when it came to the heart. He believed in timing. He believed that people meet at the right moment, even if the right moment isn't the first moment. He believed that every chapter of their lives had led them exactly here, to this evening, to this openness, to this understanding. His words struck her deeply because she realized how much wisdom he carried in his quiet soul. As the night grew darker and the soft glow of her fireplace illuminated the room, Keanu and Sandra felt a profound shift between them, an emotional rebirth that felt both frightening and exhilarating. They weren't rushing towards a conclusion. They were stepping slowly, intentionally, into a truth their hearts had always known. And as they sat side by side on her couch, sharing the kind of gentle silence that only exists between souls that recognize one another, they both understood something they never dared to speak aloud. Their story wasn't a what-if anymore. It was becoming a what now. Their truth was no longer buried. Their emotions were no longer hidden. Their hearts were finally beginning to awaken to the love that time had carefully preserved for decades. In the weeks that followed their emotionally charged dinner and the quiet, transformative night at Sandra's home, both Keanu and Sandra found themselves living in a world that suddenly felt softer, warmer, and more meaningful than it had in years. It wasn't that anything dramatic had happened between them. There was no sudden romantic confession, no dramatic change in their daily lives. But something in the air between them had undeniably shifted, as though the emotional distance they had carefully maintained over decades had finally dissolved. Their interactions carried a deeper intimacy, not in the physical sense, but in the emotional language that only soul-deep connections could speak. Every conversation felt richer, every shared silence felt fuller, and every glance carried a gentleness born from years of unspoken truth, finally finding the courage to breathe. They weren't rushing into a label or forcing a direction. Rather, they were stepping into a space that had always existed around them, but now welcomed them with open arms. Keanu began noticing small changes in himself. He found that he looked forward to each day a little more, not because of his work or responsibilities, but because there was always a moment, sometimes a message, sometimes a call, sometimes just a memory, that reminded him of Sandra. The quiet heaviness he often carried in his heart, shaped by years of grief and solitude, seemed to lift gently with every conversation they shared. It was as if she had become a soft anchor in his life, grounding him in ways he didn't fully understand but deeply valued. He felt lighter, not because his burdens had vanished, but because someone finally stood close enough to share the emotional weight with him without asking for anything in return. She didn't treat him like a broken man who needed fixing. She treated him like a human being who deserved understanding. And that, more than anything, began healing parts of him he never expected would heal. Sandra, too, felt a transformation stirring inside her. She had spent so much of her life being the strong one, the one who laughed off her pain, the one who kept others comfortable, the one who hid her vulnerabilities behind wit and humor. But with Keanu, she didn't need to perform. She didn't need to pretend. She didn't need to protect herself with jokes or charm. She could simply be without the pressure of perfection or the fear of judgment. For the first time in a long while, she felt emotionally safe, not because Keanu said all the right things, but because he listened with a sincerity that reached the deepest parts of her soul. She found herself opening up about fears she didn't even know she carried. Fears about aging, about love, about loneliness, about the constant pressure of expectations. And he listened with the kind of stillness that made her feel like she wasn't alone in any of it. Their connection, once quietly powerful, was now becoming undeniably magnetic. Not in the dramatic Hollywood way that tabloids love to fabricate, but in a way that felt deeply human, slow, gentle, and organically unfolding. They continued spending time together, and with each meeting, the emotional intimacy between them grew stronger. There was a particular afternoon that marked a turning point, one neither of them spoke about afterward, but both carried with unmistakable clarity in their hearts. They were sitting in Keanu's garden, a peaceful, sunlit sanctuary overflowing with greenery and soft winds, talking about the unpredictability of life, the unexpected twists that shape destinies, and the quiet courage it took to embrace emotional truth later in life. At some point, Sandra grew emotional, not dramatically, but with a subtle shift in her voice that revealed a vulnerability she rarely allowed. She admitted that one of her greatest fears was arriving at the end of her life knowing she never truly gave her heart a chance to love fully again. Keanu, moved by the sincerity of her confession, gently reached out and rested his hand over hers. It wasn't romantic. It was grounding, steady, and deeply symbolic. He looked into her eyes, not with expectation, but with an honesty that felt like a lifetime of silence breaking open. He told her that everyone deserved to feel love without fear, and that the most painful regret in life wasn't losing love, but denying oneself the chance to feel it. His voice was so soft, so vulnerable that Sandra felt her chest tighten. They didn't speak for several moments. They simply sat, their hands touching lightly, both absorbing the gravity of their shared awareness. In that quiet afternoon, something inside them shifted irrevocably. For the first time, they felt the possibility of love between them not as an idea or a fantasy, but as something real, something present, something waiting patiently for them to acknowledge. In the days that followed, Keanu and Sandra found themselves thinking about that moment more than they expected. It wasn't a romantic scene. It was an awakening, a realization that their connection had matured from friendship into something emotionally deeper, something neither of them could dismiss anymore. They continued their walks, their dinners, their long conversations, but now there was an unspoken tenderness in everything they did. They noticed small details, how their hands brushed accidentally but lingered a second longer, how their eyes met in moments of silence, how laughter between them seemed to echo with a new warmth. They hadn't labeled anything yet, but both of them knew they were no longer living in the realm of friendship alone. Their hearts had begun to shift their language, slowly and gently. The shift became even more undeniable one evening when Sandra invited Keanu to watch an old movie with her. It was not one of their films, just an old classic she loved since childhood. As they sat on her couch, the room lit only by the soft glow of the screen, they found themselves naturally leaning closer until their shoulders touched lightly. Neither moved away. The closeness felt effortless, warm, and strangely familiar, like they had been leaning into one another for a lifetime without even realizing it. Halfway through the film, Sandra glanced at Keanu and found him already looking at her with an expression she had never seen before, a softness so deep and tender it made her breath catch. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. In that quiet exchange of glances, an emotion passed between them that words could never capture. A realization sighed quietly inside her heart. This was love, not loud, not rushed, not dramatic, but real. Keanu felt the same truth settling inside him like a gentle sunrise. He had known affection before. He had known heartbreak. He had known fleeting connections. But this slow, steady unfolding of something sacred felt unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't passion born from impulse, nor was it longing born from loneliness. It was the kind of love that formed from years of loyalty, years of emotional alignment, years of unspoken understanding. It was love with roots, love with history, love with purpose. It was love that felt earned, not imagined. By the time the movie ended, they were still sitting close, still sharing the warmth of a moment that neither dared to break with words. Sandra rested her head on his shoulder, not affectionately, not playfully, but in a way that felt like surrender, like acceptance, like she was finally allowing herself to lean into the truth she had been avoiding her entire life. Keanu rested his cheek lightly on her hair, closing his eyes as a profound peace washed over him. In that quiet moment, they both felt the same truth settle into their hearts with undeniable clarity. Their story was no longer a story of almost or what if. It had become a story of finally. Their love, real, patient, decades in the making, had begun its first breath. In the days following the quiet evening spent watching the old movie together, something inside both Keanu and Sandra awakened with a depth neither of them could deny anymore. It was as if the years of emotional restraint, the decades of protecting their bond behind polite boundaries, had finally dissolved in the softness of that shared silence. They didn't rush into anything. There was no dramatic conversation, no sudden declaration. Instead, their connection began to breathe naturally, like a long-suppressed truth finally stretching its limbs after years of confinement. Their hearts had entered a new chapter, one that neither planned for, yet both understood instinctively the moment it arrived. Even as they returned to their busy schedules, filming commitments, interviews, and meetings, this quiet shift lived in the background of their minds. They carried thoughts of each other like a private warmth no one else could ever see. And in Hollywood, a place overflowing with noise, this private warmth became the most precious thing they possessed. Keanu found himself waking earlier than usual just to sit in the stillness of his home, letting his mind drift back to Sandra's head resting on his shoulder, the feel of her breath against him, the gentle trust she had placed in him without hesitation. The memory wasn't romantic in a dramatic Hollywood sense. It was tender, grounding, and profoundly peaceful. It reminded him of the versions of himself he liked best, the thoughtful, patient, gentle man he sometimes lost sight of amid life's storms. With Sandra, he felt seen in those better versions, understood without needing to speak, valued without needing to prove. That kind of emotional resonance is rare even in deep relationships, yet with her, it existed effortlessly. And though Keanu had spent years navigating life quietly, carrying grief like a familiar companion, he now felt a sense of hope blooming inside him. Hope that he wasn't meant to spend the rest of his life in solitude. Hope that his heart still had the capacity to love with depth and kindness. Hope that sometimes the universe didn't take, it gave. Sandra was experiencing a transformation of her own. The soft energy she felt from that night lingered in her days like an embrace she could still feel long after he left her home. She noticed herself humming while making breakfast, smiling at strangers more easily, and looking forward to each new morning with an emotional brightness she hadn't felt in years. For so long, she had convinced herself that the best parts of love were behind her, that heartbreak, loss, and life's responsibilities had gently closed that chapter. But now she realized how wrong she had been. Love did not fade with age. Love did not disappear with time. Love simply waited for the right moment and the right person to reveal itself again. And when she thought of Keanu, she felt an emotional safety she had never known with anyone else. He understood her complexity, her fears, her insecurities, her strength, and her softness. He didn't try to fix her or mold her. He simply accepted her as she was, offering the kind of emotional grounding she had long dreamed of but never dared to expect. Their communication deepened with each passing day, not in dramatic gestures but in consistent sincerity. They sent long messages that blended emotional honesty with humor. They shared thoughts about life, memories of their younger selves, reflections on aging, and even fears they had hidden for decades. Their conversations were filled with a rare vulnerability that left them both feeling more connected than ever. Yet even with all this emotional closeness, neither of them rushed into defining their relationship. They both understood the importance of allowing their connection to unfold without pressure or expectation. They valued what they had too much to ruin it with haste. Their story was not meant for dramatic headlines. It was meant for quiet moments, genuine evolution, and soulful discovery. Their growing closeness culminated one quiet evening when Sandra invited Keanu to join her at a lakeside cabin she owned just outside the city. It was her sanctuary, a place she rarely shared with anyone because it held fragments of her most private self, her journals, her unfinished artworks, her deepest thoughts. But inviting Keanu meant she trusted him not just with her space, but with a part of her soul she normally kept hidden. Keanu accepted without hesitation, not because of the invitation itself, but because of what it represented, a step into deeper emotional territory they had both tiptoed around for too long. When Keanu arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting golden streaks across the water that shimmered like liquid fire. Sandra greeted him with a smile that held equal parts excitement and vulnerability. They walked along the wooden deck, talking about life with the same comfortable flow that had grown so natural between them. But as the sky darkened into soft twilight, their conversation shifted into something deeper. Sandra spoke about her fears, fear of opening her heart again, fear of misunderstanding their connection, fear of complicating a bond she valued so dearly. Keanu listened with the same patience and sincerity he always carried, never interrupting, never minimizing her emotions. Then when she finished, he spoke with a softness that made her chest tighten. Fear is not a sign we shouldn't walk forward, Sandy. It's a sign that what's ahead might matter more than we expected. As those words settled in the quiet air between them, Sandra felt a tear slip down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly understood. She had spent so many years being strong for others, being the emotional anchor in relationships and friendships, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone anchor her for once. Keanu gently brushed the tear from her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. It was a small gesture, but one packed with the weight of decades. It wasn't romantic in the cliched sense. It was intimate, truthful, and emotionally sincere. In that gesture, she felt everything he had ever left unspoken. As the night grew darker, they moved to the cabin porch, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed naturally. The stillness around them allowed their hearts to speak in ways words never could. Keanu looked at the lake, then at Sandra, his voice soft but steady. He told her that he had spent too many years believing that love might no longer visit his life in the same way it once did. But now, standing in this delicate moment with her, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet certainty that some connections were meant to find their way back, no matter how much time passed. Sandra felt her heart open in a way she couldn't stop even if she wanted to. She told him that she never expected her feelings for him to grow like this, but they did, slowly, naturally, and undeniably. When she finished speaking, neither of them rushed to fill the silence. They simply let the truth settle gently in the air around them. And then, in the quiet glow of moonlight reflecting off the lake, Keanu took Sandra's hand, not as a friend, not as a co-star, but as a man whose heart had finally gathered the courage to speak. She intertwined her fingers with his, not as a reflex, but as a choice. In that simple gesture, 2 decades of silence finally broke. There was no dramatic kiss, no Hollywood scene, no emotional outburst. There was simply truth, soft, steady, and profound. Their connection had grown from seeds planted decades ago, watered with loyalty, nurtured by respect, and strengthened by time. And now, finally, those seeds had blossomed into something real, something undeniable, something beautifully theirs. As they sat there hand in hand, gazing at the shimmering water, both of them understood what the world had speculated for years. Their bond wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't a storyline crafted by fans or headlines. It was real, quiet, powerful love, the kind that doesn't need declarations or labels to prove its existence. The truth behind their love was simple. They had always been connected. They had always been each other's safe place. And now, after years of patience, life had finally given them permission to embrace the love that had lived quietly in their hearts for a lifetime. Their story wasn't ending here, it was beginning.